History Class with Dr. W. As we continue our discussion of World War I, in this final lecture, we're going to talk about some of the outcomes of the war and lingering aspects of the war that are going to have an impact well into our first decade of this course, the 1920s. World War I casts a long shadow over our period of 1920 to 45. In some ways laying the groundwork for many of the cornerstone events that happened throughout the period. Among them, World War I lays the groundwork for what becomes known as the Red Scare. The work of the CPI and the hyper-patriotism that it spread created an atmosphere of fear and suspicion, which in the wake of the war is going to have to find a new target. And that happens to be communists in the United States. We're going to talk about the Red Scare and much more about this in future lectures. World War I also, as it turns out, laid the groundwork for the Great Depression. I mentioned that $33 billion that Germany was to be forced to repay, especially in the war-torn atmosphere of post-war Europe, when really nobody had any money and few had any opportunities to make money. Germany is going to enter a deep depression of its own, and trying to pay off that war debt was a big part of it. Germany's failure to pay off the debt carried over to other European nations who then couldn't pay back the United States for its assistance during the war. This cycle of debt and the failure to be able to pay ultimately sank the Western world into depression. And obviously we're going to talk much more about that as we get closer to that part of the course. And finally, as most of you already know, World War I laid the groundwork for what became later World War II. The powers who drew up the Treaty of Versailles just simply didn't understand the psychology of the Germans. Perhaps Wilson had it right when he envisioned a peace without victors. Surely such a peace would not have enraged the Germans so much as the Treaty of Versailles did. As it was, the Germans were furious at the sacrifices they were forced to make and the fact that they were forced to concede guilt for the war. And many Germans, among them the young Adolf Hitler, disliked the bitter pill of defeat and began plotting an opportunity for revenge. So let's talk about some other impacts of the war on the home front. First, World War I advanced the position of the federal government in this country. In some ways, World War I began to create the conditions that would make possible something like the New Deal another decade or more later. Prior to the war, during the Progressive Era, the nation relied essentially on volunteerism for whatever welfare was provided. Voluntary cooperation of business and government, local and other interests. In World War I, though, we were confronted with a problem that local government and small groups simply couldn't address. For the first time, really, we were mobilized as a nation. We reluctantly abandoned the focus on volunteerism and local aid and turned instead to the federal government. Also during the war, the government adopted entirely new levels of professionalism, organization, and layers of government. We saw the government mobilized as never before. Accompanying this thought in the wake of the war was the belief that perhaps big business wasn't all bad. Organizing things of a large size and scope seemed to work in World War I, and might even be preferable to small local affairs. The government relaxed antitrust law, eased efforts at trust busting, and seeking out monopolies. In the 1920s, as we will see, the government cooperated with and supported big business as never before. The war also set in motion demographic trends that would shape the United States in the 1920s. Immigration had been increasing since the 1880s, in spite of some nativist thought opposed to immigration. With the onset of World War I, though, it became extremely difficult for immigrants to get out of Europe, and by 1918, immigration had slowed to a trickle. At the same time, the U.S. war machine cranked into gear. There was demand for jobs on an unprecedented scale. Able-bodied men were shipped off to war. Immigrants weren't coming in anymore, so somebody had to do the vastly important work in the war industries. These factors created an ideal environment for the Great Migration, in which tens of thousands of blacks flooded out of the South, making for the northern cities. Drawn by the lure of northern jobs, blacks were also pushed away from the South by many different factors. Among them were the deplorable economic conditions in the South. Most blacks at that time remained sharecroppers, though many others went as well, shop owners and minister and others. In 1916, a poor wave of crops, made worse by an attack of a critter called the bull weevil, really beset the Southern economy and inspired many blacks to leave the South. They were also driven by disfranchisement, the fact that they were not allowed to vote, the fact that many of them were deprived of education. And of course, many of them were simply fleeing the realities of racism in the South and overall the very harsh conditions. Blacks fleeing these conditions moved into the northern cities by the tens of thousands during this period, seeking improvement for themselves as well. Many, in fact, did find improvement in the North. They found jobs in the war industries for the most part, and many of them earned a decent wage. Many of them found opportunities for advancement, promotion, better wages, and better lives, and thus many who moved to the North wrote back to the South to recruit more, and the migration fueled itself as the decade went on. Most Southerners resented the migration. Plantation owners threatened their workers. Politicians put up obstacles, requiring identification or proof of employment before anyone could leave. And the revived Ku Klux Klan grew more active in trying to combat the exodus. Even in the North, blacks didn't always meet with success and happiness. The influx of migrants began to disturb many Northerners as well. Blacks were often used as strikebreakers in the growing numbers of strikes. They confronted poor housing, poor jobs at times, sometimes violence, segregation, and racism. And yet, their numbers continued to grow. By the end of the war, as the soldiers began to return home, they confronted a changed landscape. With the war economy winding down and jobs in the war industry shutting down, millions of American soldiers came back to the home front, finding an economy slipping towards depression. Blacks were among the first to lose their jobs. Returning soldiers found the job market tightening. Immigration numbers began climbing again, and all of these factors contributed to an atmosphere of tension in the northern cities. Also during the war, representation in labor unions grew dramatically, as did government recognition of those unions. The wartime boom led to increased prices and inflation. Typically, wages didn't rise enough to keep up with inflation, if at all. The government initially suspended many of the gains of unions in previous years. Recognition of limited hours, safety regulations, child labor laws, and the like were put aside in favor of increased production. Labor obviously objected. The number of strikes increased each year during the war, and the economy was relatively strong. By war's end, Woodrow Wilson, who supported labor and was sympathetic to their cause, recognized that labor unions might add some order to the process, and negotiating with them could ease the unrest. By war's end, some of the strikes ended with gains for the unions, and some groups gained the 8-hour workday and increased wages. In the rapidly declining work environment after the war, in 1919, things were ripe for crisis. As 1919 began, Woodrow Wilson was in France working on peace negotiations. Upon his return, he was very much distracted from domestic issues in favor of pushing for the treaty. He was on his speaking tour for a month, then stricken with the stroke, as I mentioned previously. For virtually the entire year of 1919, one of the most chaotic in our nation's history, the nation was essentially without its leader. As such, there was virtually no plan for domestic reconstruction after the war. The economy was in turmoil. Blacks and immigrants continued entering the cities in rising numbers. Labor was struggling to keep its wartime gains, and business was in the process of cutting benefits. I mentioned previously the influenza pandemic that swept across the country in 1918 and 19, adding tremendous disruption to an already chaotic and difficult time. The super-patriotism cultivated by the CPI during World War I had not abated. Groups like the CPI continued to foster suspicion and fear of foreigners. It only needed to find a new target in the aftermath of the war. That target would be the communists. In our next group of lectures, we'll be talking about the outcomes of all of these factors, the Red Scare of 1919.